Welcome back to This Week in Creationism, episode number 7. I'm Joel Duff, your host, as we look at the headlines from the world of creationism over this past week. This week, soft tissue preservation, Dino's DNA again. Yes, it seems like we talk about dinosaur DNA all the time. That's because creationists keep talking about it. Late Cenozoic flood boundary, that's the ICR flood boundary. Let's look at that. And Noah's Ark found. AIG addresses the latest claim that Noah's Ark has been found in the mountains of Ararat. All right, let's kick it off with ICR and a little dino DNA. Institute for Creation Research has a current article right now. Fossil chromatin looks young. Now, if you've watched my dinosaur DNA video from this past week, I addressed the exact paper that they're going to talk about in this particular article. I anticipated that we would be seeing this in the young Earth creationist literature, and I anticipated what they wouldn't say. And sure enough, I was right. They did not talk about the distinguish between the different kinds of preservation and what it means to preserve DNA. If you haven't seen it yet or want to know what I'm talking about, you can look me up and find my video on dinosaur DNA. And the questions I had asked there was how long can sequenceable DNA be preserved? That would be strands of DNA that are identifiable in terms of their molecular structure, having a backbone, the sugar phosphate backbone, and the A, T, C's, and G's, having enough preserved that you could actually sequence it and that you would be able to actually learn something about a dinosaur from that. And versus how far back can we detect the remains of DNA? All right. And the remains of DNA can be highly modified molecules that are the remnants of some of the atoms of DNA, but not necessarily an intact, complete DNA molecule that we would be able to actually sequence and learn and gain information from. And you have to distinguish between those two when you look at these papers that talk about, because they just reference staining DNA, but they don't talk about what form that DNA is in. Anyway, I go into a lot of detail about that in my dinosaur DNA video. And the main point of it is that creationists, and I predicted, creationists will claim that this new fossil that had been found with intact DNA in it that's 125 million years old, well, they go right into, they say, look, that it has chromatin. Well, chromatin is how DNA is packaged in your chromosomes. Your DNA is actually wound around a protein called a histone, and that helps to organize your DNA. And they did stain and see the what looks like to be the shadows or remains of chromatin structure. That does not actually mean that the actual chromatin exists. In other words, those specific proteins that are histone proteins and DNA strands are present in some kind of intact form. They may be present in the form of degraded products or preserved products because they've bound molecularly to other molecules in the environment. And but that's very different than suggesting that somehow there's just DNA that's been preserved, as if we could go in and extract that DNA and then find out about dinosaurs. And as I said in the video, if it really were as easy as that, if there really was intact DNA in these dinosaurs, you can bet that somebody would have just done a DNA extraction and sequenced it and told us something about dinosaurs. I certainly would do that if I had access to those supposed DNA dinosaur molecules that these scientists are finding. So there is a gradation of types of preservation. And when you look at dinosaur DNA, it may be the bare remnants that are highly modified that have been in stasis for long periods of time, potentially 100 million years, as opposed to looking at something like a mammoth and you see its preserved DNA. Well, its preserved DNA still has actual strands of DNA that are intact, and we can actually sequence a mammoth from a mammoth fossil, whereas we haven't done that from dinosaur fossils, which tells you they're different from each other. I mean, if they were the same, if this was the same kind of DNA being preserved, if this was the same soft tissues being preserved, we would know a lot more about those tissues because we would be able to investigate them with tools that we study any other tissue that's around today. All right, so it wasn't shocked at all to see from Institutes from Creation Research, especially from Brian Thomas. He just got a PhD in which he looked at soft tissues. he should know about the more recent literature, which I talk about in my video, but does he reference any of it? Unfortunately not. He references an old piece of literature from, well, 15 years old, talking about how long DNA can last, and doesn't really get into the more recent literature involved in this stuff. So that's unfortunate. And if we flip over to creation.com or Institute for Creation Ministries International, we find they had a short video that they showed on their website, struggling with soft tissues and dinosaurs. And in that 2-minute video, they also talk about dinosaur DNA. They say, oh, and dinosaur DNA has been found. And then they go on to mention how, well, scientists, though, have shown that dinosaur DNA can't survive more than 6.8 million years, and yet they're saying this is a 100 million year old DNA. Aren't those two stories incompatible with each other? Therefore, dinosaurs really aren't as old as secular scientists say they are. However, same problem. When they say the DNA has been found in dinosaurs, that's not necessarily the same as the DNA that scientists are talking about when they say that DNA only survives for potentially maybe 6 million years. What they mean by DNA there is the strand of DNA that actually has the same architecture of a DNA strand that's in you or I. Can I pull that out and see the sugar phosphate backbone and the different parts of the other parts of the nucleotides? Preserving something not quite like the exact version of DNA might last far longer than sequenceable or identifiable DNA molecules that have more molecular structure that's similar to today's molecules. Anyway, yeah, I expect this will just keep coming up over and over and over again. It's a very popular talking point, but again, they're using very loose terms and not describing in detail what they mean by fossilized and what they mean by preserved. And I have to admit, the secular literature doesn't do a very good job of that either. When they promote these stories, they just talk about staining for DNA. They talk about DNA without distinguishing maybe different forms of preservation or types of preservation. All right, let's move on back to Institute for Creation Research. And now we have Jeffrey Tompkins talking about the fossils still say no. This was the article that inspired another video that I made about the flood boundary. The flood boundary is if there's a worldwide flood, NOAHIC flood, then there are going to be rocks that are part of the fossil record of the geological column that are part of the flood, that were laid down by the flood. But then there is going to be some sort of layers on top of that that are after the flood, and so that means there's a boundary. There's a layer. There's a point at which, as you look up the geological column, you're looking at flood deposited rocks versus post-flood deposited rocks. And we've mentioned that ICR takes a contrary view to, say, Answers in Genesis in terms of where that boundary is found. And we see that right down here in their last bullet point, near the top of the Cenozoic, where the Neogene meets the Quaternary. That's only about 2.6 million years ago in the secular dating of the geological column. That's where they think the end of the flood is. And that has, for them, many implications about how to read the fossil record. They go in and talk about the problem with plants and some mammals and other things and try to make the case for this late fossil record. But again, when I read this article, it really impacted me in the sense that I realized, wow, I mean, their ideas about where the flood boundary are have huge implications way beyond what they're acknowledging, or maybe what they've even thought of. And they stand in contrast with Answers in Genesis, who places the flood boundary much deeper in the geological column. Hence, they propose that many of the things that Institutes for Creation Research is talking about in this article, Answers in Genesis say, no, these happened in the flood. And ICR saying, no, this didn't happen during the flood. This happened after the flood. These organisms existed after the flood. All of that I talk about in detail in this particular video I made, drawing the line and how that has implications beyond geology. All right, so where do we see it? Where do we see something else that I didn't talk about in that video? They go on, they talk about this example of Cenozoic coal. So Cenozoic coal just refers to coal layers that are found in the Cenozoic portion of the geological column, which is all rock that Answers in Genesis says formed after the flood, but ICR is saying happened during the flood. And they talk about the Powder River Basin, which is this huge layer of rock, of coal, that's found over a large area. And as they say, some coal seams in this basin exceed 100 feet thick. All right, so this is why Wyoming is well known for its coal production, right? So they have all this coal. Well, what is coal? Coal is lots and lots and lots of plant material that's compressed and turned into coal. And so they're saying that, hey, there's lots of these coal deposits around the world. Cenozoic coals are also found in the ocean. And oh yeah, this last blue section down here, and this is the key point, the only explanation for them being the coal seams is that the intense energy of the receding phase of the flood transported and buried these land plants in late flood continental runoff. They're trying to explain these ocean coal deposits, but also they try to explain all this coal deposit, these thick coal deposits, as being late in the fossil record, and somehow there was massive amounts of plant material that was buried right at the very end of the floodwaters as the floods were running off of the continents. Well, I went and looked up the Powder River Basin, and the thing about those particular coal seams is they're not described in the secular literature as being the result of floods or some kind of transportation and requiring lots of energy. No, they're described as in-place swamps, and the common knowledge of what happened in Wyoming is that that area was a low, shallow sea, which had very large, expansive areas as sea levels went up and down of swamp. Think of Louisiana, right? Southern Louisiana, massive swampy area that's been a swampy area for a very long period of time. Organic materials building up there, and there's thick layers of organic material in the Louisiana swamps. And if you think of Wyoming as being large sections of Wyoming and Idaho as being under these swampy conditions, that could add up to hundreds of feet thick layers of organic material that eventually is covered with sediment, all right, as the land changes and that ocean is pushed away. Due to various plate tectonic forces, all right, and the rising of the entire western U.S. And it's not at all a cataclysmic-y looking thing, right? It looks just like swamps that are preserved, and it's I think it creates more problems for answers and for creation institutes for creation research than anything. And this is where this diagram, I think, will give you an idea. So I've used this image before, but these green layers of rock, Answers in Genesis say, are all deposited after the flood, whereas the blue is what Answers in Genesis says is flood deposits. You can see ICR thinks the flood deposits are much more extensive. And so where you see a significant difference is Answers in Genesis would look at those same coal layers and say, no, those were deposited after the flood. Maybe that's some remnant plant material from the flood, but mostly they would say, no, these are forests or swamps that developed after the flood, and they were preserved in the last 4,500 years and developed and turned into those coal seams. Whereas ICR says, no, this was all plant material that was alive down here, right? Anything that is in this segment had to be something that was living in the pre-flood world. And then when the flood began, it buried all this stuff, buried a whole bunch of coal down here. This coal is very different because it's made up of completely different plants that are all extinct. And this coal up here is made out of flowering plants. So it's also two different kinds of coal. And Answers in Genesis kind of has an answer for that in terms of like one type, and then later on flowering plants dominated after the flood, and that's why those coal seams are flowering plants. ICR can't use that because they've got somehow the flood segregating lycopods and all these other extinct plants from these coal seams that are predominantly flowering plants. And they're all being preserved during the period of the flood rather than afterwards. Anyway, just an example of where ICR and AIG are going to have very different views in terms of how they explain. They have completely different explanations for these coal layers. All right, moving back to creation.com or Creation Ministries International, they had just a short article just announcing the publication of a new children's book, Discovering the Truth About Dinosaurs, in which you can learn the proper understanding of dinosaurs within a young Earth context, but for kids. And it's kind of a book that includes a lot of alliteration and rhyming and so forth with names and things. But a couple things caught my eye that I just had to point out. They talk about sort of these bullet points are sort of like big picture, big ideas that are presented in the book. And the one that really got to me was, they talked about, okay, there's a brief time in a perfect state where dinosaurs roamed together with man. That would be like the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve sinned, right? The dinosaurs must have been there with man. I don't know why dinosaurs had to be right next to man. I mean, the world's a big place. But I guess since they would say that Adam had to name dinosaurs, he at least had to be close enough to see them at some point. But then what really got me was this next line, the fall, when Adam and Eve had to leave the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve were driven out of the garden because of their sin. They couldn't be in God's holy presence anymore inside the garden of Eden. And so they were driven out of Eden. All right, that's in the scriptures, all right? That's our description of what happened. But then they add on this, along with the animals, dinosaurs included. First I look at that and I think, I don't remember seeing anything in the scriptures that tell me that the animals were driven out of the garden, all right, or driven out of the Garden of Eden. Now, they may wish to infer that, like maybe because they would say maybe the animals are also corrupted by Adam's sin, and if they're corrupted, they also can't be in the presence of God. Even though God in other places, speaks of the animals being good, right, and his creation. But this is adding to the scriptures, right? This is saying, teaching kids that, when you imagine Adam and Eve leaving the garden, there was this huge, all the animals that he named are also coming out with him, like, this big train of animals leaving the Garden of Eden, including the dinosaurs. No, leave the scriptures as the scriptures and say what the scriptures say, and don't add on to it unless you're going to say, this is this is what we think may have happened, or we're inferring this and we speculate that that's also what happened. They just sort of, hey, this is a major point that we're going to make, that these all left. All right, then the second thing that also I noticed is they showed a screen. They have a shot of a page from from the book, and I'm looking at this. I'm reading this about T-Rex or something like a T-Rex. Just look at the behemoth, in quotes. God once said to Job, the chief of my creatures across the wide globe. Now it's a rhyme, right? God once said to Job, the chief of my creatures across the wide globe. And a lot of the phrases in this book are, mnemonics like that, things that help you remember. What I object to is why the quotes? Because the quotes make it sound like this is quoting God, right? And it even says, God once said to Job. Just look at the behemoth, God said to Job. And then in quotes again, the chief of my creatures across the wide globe. And I was thinking, I've read that passage in Job many, many, many times. I don't remember this being part of Scripture. So again, giving the sense that this is a scriptural quote, but it's not a scriptural quote. At best, it's a paraphrase, but it's not even a paraphrase. Right? Here is Job 40. Right? Look at the behemoth which I made along with you. All right, now, so you have just look at the behemoth. All right, so okay, look at the behemoth, just look at the behemoth. God once said to Job, the chief of my creatures across the wide globe. Maybe that comes from verse 19. It ranks first among the works of God. Right, but where's the chief of creatures across the wide globe? part. Uh, the Hebrew word for land and world, which I guess they could maybe interpret as globe, um, or planet, is not in this chapter, right? It's not in this portion of Scripture at all. So this is not part of Scripture. This is not a quote from Scripture, and I don't know why it has quotes around it, but it certainly gives off the vibe that they want to give off in their book, which is, oh, look, these dinosaurs, they lived, and they're chief of the creatures that God made, and they were part of the whole globe because the whole globe is going to be flooded, because on the next page it's going to talk about how the dinosaurs were destroyed by a flood, right? So they're on this globe and they want to make the point that it's a global flood. And so they quote God using the word globe, except that God doesn't say the word globe in this particular text. And you could even argue he's not even saying globe anywhere else either. Um, it just, maybe this is a minor quibble, but I think that I think you got a kid's book here. I just think you need to be careful when you quote something to be quoting for it to be a real quote. All right. Otherwise, it's just some form of plagiarism, or well, it's not even plagiarism if you're not copying from somebody else and you're making up your own description of what you think God meant in scriptures, not saying what he said. All right, Ken Ham highlighted this article, boat-like formation matching Noah's Ark discovery in Turkey. And these articles come along. It feels like about every year to 2 years, there's another article in, especially in something like this, the Christian Post, which is prone to publishing this kind of material. And 3D scans show boat-like formation matching biblical description of Noah's Ark, archaeologists say. And then you have to wonder, who are archaeologists? It makes it kind of sound like, hey, maybe there's these secular archaeologists, and you can kind of actually, here's a case where even they have to admit there's something that looks like Noah's Ark there. I think these are biblical archaeologists, this story, because there's been lots of problems with tons of people claiming they found Noah's Ark, and a lot of them turn out to be fake, intentionally altered information, and so forth, or just really imaginative things, right? You're imagining that this shape is the shape of Noah's Ark. All right, we don't need to get into the details of this particular Christian Post article. What I just want to note is that Ken Ham, he's doing what he's done quite a bit, which is Answers in Genesis is very skeptical of all of the different reports of Noah's Ark being found, and that's a good thing, right? They're not just falling for every single story, even though much of their entire enterprise, right, their entire ministry revolves around, the flood geology stuff and the fact that Noah's, really made an ark and that it landed in the mountains of Ararat, and so that is that the specific literal translation of theirs of Noah's boat ride should mean that there is this literal boat on top of that mountain somewhere. But they're still skeptical of that, and I think they would say that they don't think that it'll ever be found. And that's what Ken Ham pretty much says. These claims regarding the site have been made for more than 25 years and have been refuted many times before. We don't need to find the Ark to accept it as historical reality. So has Noah's Ark been found? We would say no. And then they go on like, why don't we need to, we don't need the Noah's Ark to actually believe. Scriptures tell us this, and we don't need that physical evidence. Now, that, as he says down here, that doesn't mean apologetics and presenting evidence aren't used by God to open hearts and minds to the gospel, all right? It'd be great if we did actually find the Ark. There's not a silver bullet that's going to convince massive numbers of skeptics to change their minds. Just like there's no silver bullet that's going to change Ken Ham's mind, right? There's no way of showing that this particular interpretation they have of the text is incorrect and that there's a better interpretation and fits maybe the evidence better. I don't think there's any way to actually, there's no silver bullet, one thing that's going to change individuals' minds in that direction either. There you have it. There's a lot of other things going on, but those are the big stories that happened in this past week. Um, yeah, I expect that there's going to be several things percolating yet with the story that's gotten kind of interesting, more interesting, I guess, um, with the Sodom Gomorrah destruction thing, with the possible meteorite. The dinosaur DNA thing has only just sort of been percolating out there, this recent thing in the news that I did another video on. And that one has been commented on by ICR, but I expect that Answers in Genesis and probably Creation Ministries International will also probably have something to say about that as well. Kenneham's been busy because they've had a big conference recently with pastors, so there's been a little less in terms of other news from them as they've been focused on that. Other than that, that's this week in creationism. And if you found this content at all interesting and want to ever hear any more of it, you could subscribe to my YouTube channel or go to my blog, thenaturalhistorian.com, where there's a variety of articles addressing uh, issues related to science and faith. We'll talk to you later. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.